Hi, I'm Vidya from Fresh Team, the data software service from Freshworks. Freshworks, as you may know, is a software as a service unicorn, which has around 250,000 customers using its suite of products. At Fresh Team, we are curating a number of interviews of thought leaders in the HR space who influence and inspire us. And we also put together stories of people and organizations that have gotten their growth strategies right. And today we are delighted and honored to have Dr. Jonathan Westover as our special guest. He is managing partner and principal at Human Capital Innovations. He is also associate professor of organizational development at the business. And I'll hand it over to you, John. Thank you and welcome to this interview session.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. I was really pleased to have the opportunity to connect with you, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share some materials with the Freshworks community. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Sure. Thanks, John.
As was mentioned, I work with Human Capital Innovations in terms of my consulting work, but I also work in the organizational leadership department in the Woodbury School of Business at Utah Valley University. So my home is in Orem, Utah. For any of you who may be unfamiliar with Utah, we hosted the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. So that's one of our bright moments on the global stage. In addition to my role as department chair and professor in the organizational leadership department, I'm also the academic director in the Center for Social Impact at Utah Valley University. So I wear many hats, and all of these hats lead to the same general space, and that is the opportunity to help organizations be more successful, to be more efficient, and to address the difficult challenges and problems that every organization faces each and every day. So my remarks today, I'm going to talk about implementing and measuring employee engagement and satisfaction, generally at first, but also specifically looking at the scale-up environment for startup businesses that are scaling, but also for other organizations that may be going through a period of transition and scaling up their business as well. And we'll be doing some Q&A and asking some questions along the way. And I welcome any offline follow-up to any of these materials or additional questions you may have. So please feel free to reach out to me at john.westover@gmail.com if you would like any more information. As was mentioned in the brief introduction, I've been working in this space for a long time. For a couple of decades, I've been working to help transform organizations across the globe. And maybe one other aspect to my interdisciplinary approach and how I address things, in addition to what's already been shared, is that I'm also a faculty fellow for ethics and public life in the Center for the Study of Ethics. And so you start to see the combination of organizational leadership, HR, OD, along with social impact and ethics. In my mind, all of these areas go together and are very important as we're trying to address complex problems within organizations. So what I'm going to cover over the next little bit, I want to start with a general look at why do we need to pay attention to strategic HR? Why is that important in the current world of work? And why would it be important in the future of work? I'm going to share a little bit about the research on creating a culture of employee engagement and job satisfaction. Some of this related to my own research, some of it related to other research out there in the field. I want to talk a little bit about measuring employee and organizational engagement. And then I'm going to share an example of an organization I've worked with as a consultant who went through rapid scale up and faced all sorts of organizational challenges. And I'll try to address specifically some of the things that they could have done and should have done in terms of measuring employee engagement and satisfaction and creating that healthy culture. And then I'll wrap things up looking at the intersection of leadership and service and what I argue is really important in any organization in today's world, and that is that we break free of our functional silos and find an opportunity to have a more interdisciplinary approach to how we address our problems that we face, both as societies, but also as organizations. Okay, so let me start with a really quick look at strategic HR. This isn't a surprise to any of you, I'm sure, but we have HR management systems that are the policies, practices, and systems that influence employees' behavior, attitudes, and performance. And these are, it's like a Venn diagram. These are intersecting components, all of which influence each other. So better behavior influences attitudes, which certainly influences performance, but vice versa. Performance influences attitudes, which influences behavior. Behavior influences performance. They're all interconnected, and there's linkages all over the place. And so within HR, we're trying to think of how do we systematically structure organizations in such a way through policies, practices, and systems that we can hit all three of those areas to lead to high performance work systems. When a company has effective human resource management, they have greater innovation, greater productivity, and they have a better reputation in the community. And in today's hyper-competitive global marketplace, this is really important because consumers do care who they shop from. They vote with their wallets and with their checkbooks, and they want to know that they are supporting organizations that have a social mission, that are socially responsible, and that are ethical in how they deal with the different issues that they face with their employees, with the environment, and with the consumers. And so when we have effective HR systems, we're able to generate better brand loyalty, better customer satisfaction and loyalty, and it's a really powerful mechanism. It comes back to this idea of human capital. So when we talk about HR, another way to phrase that is human capital, and think about all of the different forms of capital that you have within an organization. We have our financial capital, of course. We have intellectual capital, we have property, equipment, we have all of these different elements that we rely on for the organization to have a strategic advantage and a competitive advantage. And we invest in those forms of capital, we protect those forms of capital, and we make sure that they will be safe moving into the future. The same should be true for our human capital. So organizations have employees, and those employees are the source of their creativity, their innovation, their productivity, and their ultimate success. Those employees bring with them certain knowledge, skills, and abilities that you might be able to measure on a resume or through an interview process to bring people into the firm. But there's also a lot of intangibles that are actually really difficult to measure and make up the entirety of the human capital, the human asset, when people come to organizations. It's the holistic nature of all the training and experience, judgment, intelligence, relationships, and insight that they bring with them to the table that will help them collaborate with others on complex problems, that will help them to address complex issues, and ultimately will drive better innovation within the organization. So we want to make sure that we value human capital just like we value other forms of capital, and that we treat it as something worthy of our investment, so that we can leverage it to the greatest extent possible and get the best bang for our buck. Everyone within an organization who has any sort of leadership role, even all the way down to the line supervisor, performs human resource management functions. So whether or not they have HR in their job title, they do HR if they're leading people. So even a supervisor that's only supervising 2 or 3 people on a regular basis, they're going to be doing all of these things that you see in this diagram. They're going to be helping to define the nature of the job itself. They're going to be forecasting future labor needs. They're going to be providing training, the front line of training for those people in their team. They're going to be involved in the interview process and the selection process for new people on the team. They're going to be doing performance evaluations and performance management. They're going to have to deal with all of that feedback and provide meaningful coaching and feedback to their employees. They will be the ones that are involved in recommending pay increases and promotions. They're the front lines of communicating corporate policies. And ultimately, it falls on the supervisor to motivate, both in terms of pay, but other intrinsic factors, and find other ways to meaningful, salient ways that are valued by employees for other benefits and rewards. And so from the lowest supervisory frontline level all the way up through the organization to middle management up through executive levels in the C-suite, anyone who's leading other people and managing people is doing HR work. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are in those roles are never trained in HR. They are never trained in these functional areas, and they don't actually know how to do these things. And this is particularly relevant within the startup space and within organizations that are rapidly scaling. Is a lot of times you have founders who have a great idea for a product or service, some really great innovative approach to addressing some sort of consumer need and generating demand. And they start a business and they start the product, providing the product or service. And then all of a sudden they see rapid growth, and they go from maybe 1 or 2 people on their startup team to 5 people to 10 people to 20 people. And then all of a sudden they have 100 employees, 500 employees, 1,000 employees. And their area of expertise is maybe in coding. Maybe it's, they created an app, or they have some sort of specialty in information systems, or they have some sort of technical expertise that allowed them to start this business with this really great idea. But they don't have any background in leadership. They don't have any background in management. They don't have any background in how to do all of these things that every person that manages people has to be able to do for an organization to be successful. So that's really partly what we're talking about today, is how important it is for every organization, from new startups all the way up through mid-sized organizations, scaling up through large organizations. They need to pay special attention to the role of human capital and the role of HR within their organization. When we have high performance work systems, it leads to higher profits. So there's a ton of research around every single arrow that you see in this diagram. And there's lots of, I could add other boxes and other arrows. So basically there's tons of research that shows when you have high performance work systems that come out of a strong HR, human capital, and employee-centric culture within an organization, it leads to higher profits. So just a couple of those relationships, you can see the pathways here. Interesting jobs. When you design interesting work for your employees to do, that leads to satisfied workers. That leads to lower absenteeism, lower turnover, lower costs, and higher profits. It also leads to more satisfied customers, higher sales, and higher profits. But on the other side of the equation, when you have a really positive workplace culture where people feel safe, they feel valued, they feel like they can contribute and they want to contribute, and they're not worried to fail, but they're going to try new things. When you have that kind of an innovative, knowledge sharing type of a culture, it drives innovation, it drives creativity, it drives higher quality, which leads to better customer satisfaction, greater productivity, and higher profits. So HR and human capital and employee-centric culture, that's just not warm, fuzzy, fluffy type of stuff that we're talking about. That directly also hits the bottom line of the company. If you invest in the human capital, just like investing in other forms of capital, you will drive higher profits. And there's so much research to demonstrate that. So those are some of the types of things that we're going to continue to explore together today. Another issue that I want to briefly address is this idea of person-organization fit, and person-job fit is a similar construct, and value congruence. That's another similar construct. So it's the basic idea that when you bring people into the organization, that person brings with them and all of their collective experience and background and worldview and perspective. They have values that they bring with them to the table. They have a driving purpose, you know, answering their why. Why do they want to be there? Why do they want to be part of this organization? And when the alignment between the person and their values and the organization and its values is really tight, and that there's a close alignment, we say there's a high person organization fit. When there's a close alignment with the specific job that they're performing, we would say there's a high person job fit. When those values align, another term is value congruence. And so basically when there's high person job fit, high person organization fit, and high value congruence within an organization, that leads to higher job performance, stronger future job choices, lower rates of intent to leave and turnover, higher job satisfaction, higher organizational commitment. And these are all outcomes that organizations should want, because ultimately it will lead to a high performance work system that will help the organization to be profitable and successful in a sustainable way. Not just something that will help them be successful this quarter or even this year, but especially if they're scaling, they have to be thinking about a year out, 5 years out, 10 years out, and putting in place the systems, processes, policies, structures, and systems that will help them to manage that growth and to mature as an organization. And that will only happen as you have good people within the organization to help that growth occur. Another way of thinking about this in terms of person job fit, person organization fit, and value congruence is the mission of the organization. And this can lead to strong engagement outcomes for employees. So what is the mission statement of the organization? Now, you know, a new startup, they very likely aren't necessarily focused right from the get-go about a mission statement, about a value statement, because they're excited about the product or service that they're providing. Now, depending on how they're seeking funding, if they're going trying to get investors, or they're trying to go get a business loan, you know, they're going to have to create that statement as part of their prospectus. But that's not in terms of the formal documentation, but that's not always the first thing on their mind. But it's a really important aspect that you want to be thinking about when you're starting up a new venture. What is the driving purpose of this organization? What value are you going to add into the world? And that needs to be reflected in your mission statement. And when you have a mission statement, a powerful mission statement, that's a reflection on and there's a clear reflection of the internalization of that mission statement within the broader organizational culture, that then drives higher levels of organizational commitment of employees within the organization. And that leads to better performance outcomes for the organization, and it leads to higher levels of personal engagement from employees within the organization. So we can't overlook sometimes the cliched elements of like mission statements, value statements, purpose statements. A mission statement in and of itself doesn't do anything. So if you just create a nicely worded mission statement or a nicely worded value statement, that's not necessarily going to do anything for your organization. But when that mission statement is truly embedded into the organization and the culture reflects that mission statement, then it does matter. And then it will drive higher levels of performance and engagement of employees. Now, really quickly, I want to share with you a model that I've developed in my own research in terms of work quality characteristics, employee engagement, and job satisfaction. So here you see a diagram that shows relationships within a statistical model. I'm not going to bore you with a complex statistical model output or anything like that, but you can see the inner relationships here and the feedback loops here and how they influence everything. And when we think about employee engagement, we think about job satisfaction, we think about designing meaningful, effective jobs. These are all the types of variables that lots of research has demonstrated are really important, including a lot of my own research. And I've done a lot of comparative international research where I've looked at how this model plays out across the globe, across dozens of countries, and seeing the similarities and differences in those countries about which of these factors are more important in particular sectors and particular types of organizations, of different levels of jobs and so forth. Because what I hope will come across here is that there's not an easy fix. There's not a one size fits all to employee engagement and job satisfaction. And as you see in the quote at the bottom, context matters. A meaning is derived from context. Observations are embedded and must be understood within context. So a national context, a local context, an organizational context, a job context, all of these things matter in terms of how you're going to design engaging, satisfying work for your employees. And we can't overlook that part, that we have to tailor and specialize our approach. But here you can see general individual control variables in terms of individual and family circumstances, organizational characteristics and job characteristics, all sorts of things that are important to consider, different ways of slicing the data and different ways of understanding different types of employees. And in terms of general buckets of variables that are really important, we have work-life balance types of variables, we have intrinsic rewards, we have extrinsic rewards, and we have work relations types of variables. And there's interrelations between all of these, and then they influence job satisfaction and employee engagement. So when we have a better sense of what our organization mission is, what our values are, and the type of people that we want in the organization, so there's a high level of person-organization fit, we can then start to do the hard work of designing engagement evaluation systems so that we can see where our employees are at in relation to these types of variables and others, so that we can ensure a really meaningful and powerful organizational experience for them, where they feel valued, they feel supported, and they can continue to help the organization to succeed. All right, now, other things to consider in terms of measuring employee engagement. Again, I want to hit home this point that there's not a one size fits all. Okay, I'm going to share with you some basic approaches as a starting point, but you need to understand that every organization is different, and even similar types of organizations within the same industry or sector are still different. Their founders are different. Their culture is going to be different. The types of employees they attract are going to be different. And so we can't just use a one size fits all. So these are general thoughts and principles that can be a starting point for additional discussion, dialogue, exploration within your individual organizational context or your individual unit that you can then flesh out to create an engagement strategy for your organization. It starts with determining engagement outcomes for your organization. I have a certain way of defining employee engagement. Another firm might have a different way of defining employee engagement. And within the academic literature, there's kind of a general consensus about what that means, but within organizations that might be a little bit different, and what matters to them might be a little bit different. So if you want to measure something, it always starts with first clearly determining what those outcomes are that you want, right? And if you don't have clear alignment between the outcomes that you're going to try to achieve and the metrics you're using to measure, then you're never going to get to where you want to be. So first it starts with determining engagement outcomes, and then you need to start going through the process, and this is hard work, but you need to convene groups of employees so that you can, through focus groups, through interviews, through different means, so that you can get employee input into the process and you can create employee buy-in into the process. If your engagement strategy and your approach to measuring engagement within your organization is just a top-down, the C-suite says we're going to use this survey, now everyone go do it, and managers make sure your employees do this. If that's the approach, it's not going to be particularly meaningful or helpful for your organization. So you need to make sure that you're creating employee buy-in. But I will fully recognize that takes more time, that takes more resources, that takes more energy and commitment to do it that way, but it will lead to better outcomes. You need to identify what's really truly important to your employees. What are the salient motivators of your employees? And just because something, if you're a CEO or you're in the C-suite, just because something's valuable to you at your particular stage in life doesn't mean it's that same thing's going to be valuable to the other people working with you as part of your team. So you need to talk to them. You need to understand what they really truly value. And if you're going to try to seek ways of leveraging their capacity and help increase their motivation and engagement levels, if there's a misalignment between what you're offering and what they want, then you're not going to have the desired outcomes, plain and simple. And organizations miss this point all the time. It is so common for organizations to not be clear on the outcomes, to not have mechanisms in place that employees actually value. And so then it just becomes an exercise of collecting data that's not actually particularly meaningful or helpful to helping things improve within the organization. You can also perform a driver's analysis, similar to, figuring out what's important to employees, figure out what, and this can happen through data analytics and statistical analyses, but what actual drivers are the most important. So sometimes employees say something's really important to them, but when you actually do the analysis, you realize, oh, that doesn't actually play out in the data. It's not actually as important as they say it is in terms of how it influences their motivation and performance. So doing a driver's analysis is also going to be important, and not just doing that one time, but doing that on a regular basis, every year, revisiting the core drivers. Use pulse surveys and single click polls, not exclusively. That's not going to be your only way of trying to get the pulse of your people and to understand what they want and need. But that can be one mechanism to get some of that data. Develop a continuous listening strategy. Something as simple as, and it sounds cliche, but something as simple as an open door policy can be really powerful. Or if you have shared workspace where you're actually interacting with each other on a regular basis, making sure that you're approachable so that people can come to you and talk to you and share with you. Making sure that employees know that you want to listen to them, that their input matters, is really, really important. And if you create that kind of an environment, then not only will that in and of itself will lead to higher engagement, but it will also help you better understand what they need and want in terms of support, in terms of the various motivating factors, so that they will perform at a higher level. We often talk about exit interviews, which are important. If someone's leaving, we should want to know why, especially if they're leaving for what they see as a better opportunity somewhere else. We need to understand why that's happening. But we don't want to just do that when people are leaving. If we're losing our best employee because they see greener pastures somewhere else, we can learn from that, but we don't want them to leave in the first place. So a stay interview is also very powerful. And you can have regular stay interviews with your employees, particularly your best employees. Like, what is it? What do they value about being part of the organization? What will it take for them to stay with the organization? Have that discussion on a regular basis with all of your people, but particularly your best people. Turn to employee recognition activities. You want to make sure that all employees know that what they're doing is valued by the organization, and you want to make sure that they're acknowledged for that work. And so there's lots of ways to do this, but think about how to do recognition activities. Measure things like retention rate by division, by department. You want to not just know a generic retention rate for the overall organization, but you want to be able to see specifics under individual leaders even. So you can understand if there's a leadership problem, for example, and track productivity metrics. Again, if you start with outcomes and you know what you want to achieve, that will inform your metrics that you're going to measure over time. The types of productivity. Some types of productivity metrics may not actually be all that relevant to the type of engagement you're trying to drive and the types of outcomes that you're trying to drive. So just make sure that you're thinking about those metrics always. When I think about metrics, for example, I think about the movie Moneyball. You may or may not be familiar with that movie or that book, but I would encourage you to look into that and to watch the movie. It's a great movie. Read the book. It's a great book. The whole point of that is looking at it's a true story, looking at a Major League Baseball team as they're trying to have better alignment between the types of things they're measuring, how they're putting together their team, and the performance of the team. And ultimately, they come up with new and innovative ways to do that allow for better alignment and fit that ultimately help them to be very successful, even when they don't have a lot of money to put into getting the best players. And not that I want to advocate for not paying people, for what they're worth and the value they bring to the organization, but we all, we have limitations with our resources, and so we also need to be very thoughtful about the metrics we're using and making sure that the right metrics. We also need to be thinking about organizational culture and engagement. So not just individual engagement, that's super important, but what about that, the engagement across the organization, across groups and teams, and the individuals within those teams, institutional relationships that are important, and looking at the vertical and horizontal relationships within an organization. We know that a lot of people leave jobs because of their manager, for example. So everything else about the organization could be great. There could be great alignment between the values of the employee and the organization, of really powerful, engaging mission, great purpose. Everything else about the job could be wonderful, the types of work they're doing. And if the relationships with their team and with their manager are poor, people will still leave, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that we're monitoring those relationships and have mechanisms in place for that. So one simple tool that everyone could start using right away was developed by Gallup. It's called the Q12 Index, and many of you may already be familiar with this. It's very simple. It's 12 questions, which means you can easily build this into interviews or create a very simple survey that you send out to employees asking these questions. Now, you can formally go through Gallup to be a part of this. And if you go through Gallup, then the data that's collected from your organization goes into their big pool of data they have hundreds of thousands of data points across organizations across the globe. And then you can get analyses that look at how your organization stacks up to other organizations and such. So that could be powerful comparative data that you can utilize. But whether or not you formally go through Gallup to do that, you can still use these questions within your own organization to measure really key areas of engagement. Do you know what's expected of you at work? I mean, expectations are so important, right? Do you know what your manager wants to be done? Is that clearly communicated to you? And do you know how to fulfill that, right? If that's not the case, there's going to be a clear mismatch in terms of your effort and what you're accomplishing. So that's important. Do you have the materials and equipment to do your work right? At work, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best every day? Or are you stuck doing other menial types of jobs that don't really leverage your capacity or what you bring to the table, so on and so forth. So you can see all these questions. You could very simply, with even just, you could use a Google form. You don't need any special software. You could use a Google form, put these questions into it, send it out to your team, get their input, aggregate the data, and track it over time. And that would be a powerful mechanism for you to have a general sense of engagement within your organization. And it wouldn't cost you any money, and you could do it immediately. Every organization could do this tomorrow, and it would be super simple, right? And it would start to yield some benefits in terms of insights to your organization, whether you have 5 people on your team, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, okay? So that's one approach. Would be super simple. Now I want to share with you an example of an experience I had as a consultant with an organization that was going through rapid scale up. Because of confidentiality in terms of the consultant-client relationship, I'm not going to specify the organization, but I can talk in general terms about what they were facing and the types of issues that they were facing and those sorts of things. This wasn't a new startup. This was a local family-run business that had been around for several generations. So this company had fine-tuned their approach, their product, and the services they provided. They knew what they were doing. They were doing it well. And because they were doing it well, they were approached by investors. And when the investors came into the picture, they had this huge influx of money. They had new people involved in the decision-making of the organization, and very rapidly, over the course of about 5 years, they expanded from about 100 employees to well over 2,000 employees, not just locally pretty much within one metropolitan area, but certainly within the state, but then going nationally and having hundreds of locations nationally within just about 5 years. That is a really difficult challenge for any organization to face. And I would argue it's perhaps even more challenging for a family-run business that's scaling up rapidly than even a new entrepreneurial endeavor, a new startup that's scaling rapidly, because they had a lot of baggage, right? They had generations worth of knowledge built up within this organization, within this family running this organization, and now they had new investors, they had new people, voicing their opinions about how to do their business and how to do it effectively, cost efficiently, how to scale it, all of those types of things. So that transition, I think, was particularly hard for it. I think that kind of a transition is particularly difficult for any family-run business, but I think it definitely was a challenge for this organization that I worked with, going through that transition and bringing in people that aren't part of the family in key leadership positions and decision-making positions. Any organization scaling up that rapidly is going to struggle with just the maturing nature of the organization, the increasing complexity of the organization. And that was certainly the case here. This particular firm that I was working with, they went from a very basic management structure and hierarchy with really just a couple levels, and everyone knew everybody, and all the leaders were family members. They went from that situation to now they had a much more hierarchical structure. They had many, many layers. They were dispersed not just across a metropolitan area in one state within the US, but now across the whole country. And they were having to deal with just all the policy issues related to that, all the legal issues related to that, all the leadership issues related to that. And it was really challenging, which leads to the next point of developing organizational leaders. Traditionally, with family members running all of the leadership roles within the organization, that simply wasn't possible anymore. And those family members didn't necessarily have the abilities, the competencies, and capabilities to be able to run such a large organization. So, they were good at doing what they were doing as a family-run business, smaller scale, but now the complexity was just so much more that those family members didn't know how to do it. And so new professionalized administration was brought in, new people were brought in, and they were also trying to raise up people within the organization to take on leadership roles. That whole process was incredibly difficult for this organization. They were also trying to maintain the core of their organizational culture. So what they'd experienced for generations as a family-run business now was getting, and being dispersed nationally and bringing all these new people. Any organization would have to work really hard in that situation to try to maintain and have a sustainable, positive culture. And frankly, this organization wasn't accomplishing it. There wasn't consistency. There wasn't consistency in terms of communication. There wasn't consistency in terms of how policies were interpreted and implemented. There wasn't consistency in all the institutional mechanisms that help to reinforce the culture. So they were dealing with all the problems related to that. Because of this, they had what I would say were two major challenges that I was brought in to help them face. One was just a huge level of employee turnover. Now, the industry that they were in, relatively, it's all relative, right? We always have to think about industry norms in terms of what normal turnover is. But this industry tended to have a little bit higher turnover than some other industries. So that in and of itself wasn't a problem that they had high turnover, but the massive amount of employee turnover that they had, which outstripped industry norms. They had about 10 times the industry norms for turnover. They had an incredible amount of turnover within this organization, in part driven by problems with the culture, problems with the organization, problems with the leadership. So people were coming in and they were leaving. And they went through this revolving door of employees over the course of a year. And at one point, we calculated, even for the lowest level employee within this organization, which for the lowest level, entry level employee, really they just needed a high school education with not a lot of extra, skill or specialty. And so even for that type of person coming into the organization, we calculated that it cost them about $5,000 for each of those people. So you start to multiply that 5,000 times just for this lower level type of employee. They estimated, we calculated that they went through about 2,500 hires every year just for that lower level type of position. That is insane levels of turnover. And $5,000 a pop for each of those people, we're talking millions of dollars that's costing the organization in the constant revolving door. And we're not even talking about higher levels of positions. And there was turnover in those higher level positions as well. And that's more expensive, right, when you get into higher level positions. So how do we address this turnover problem? That was one of the key questions. And addressing and confronting the internal leadership and politics, because you had this tight-knit family that had been running the organization for a long time, and now you have new people coming in. There was a lot of butting of heads and a lot of, people saying one thing in a leadership meeting and then going behind people's backstabbing, a lot of passive aggressive behaviors where people would say one thing to your face and then do something different when you weren't around. All those types of things were happening. And I experienced many of those things firsthand as I'm trying to understand the complexities of the challenges of the organization and talk to different leaders, getting different stories from different people, helping them develop measurement tools to understand their engagement and satisfaction that was influencing the turnover issues that they were facing. That was incredibly challenging because I was getting different information and being told different stories based on who I was talking to, and there wasn't consistency in the leadership team. And there wasn't a consistent buy-in from the leadership team and even having me there as a consultant to try to address these issues. Some people were grateful that I was there trying to help because I was bringing an expertise to the table that they didn't have. Other people, were very skeptical and felt very defensive and felt like I was dangerous because I was there, because they felt like that would put their jobs in danger. So all these dynamics were at play as I was trying to work with them and to help them. Now, I worked with them for about 1.5 years. And during that time, we put together some really good measurement tools. We implemented them consistently and holistically across the organization. And we started to see some good outcomes. We were getting really positive feedback, especially from supervisors and kind of middle management level people within the hierarchy. They were really loving what the types of insights they were getting and the types of analytics we were providing them. We were helping them make better hiring decisions. We were helping them retain their people. There was a lot of good positive movement. Unfortunately, I didn't see the same type of excitement at the executive level in the C-suite because many of them felt defensive and they felt they felt that they were being put in harm's way because of the approaches we were taking. And it ultimately culminated in there were still continued problems in terms of the finances. There's expenses were out of control, and we just weren't getting the traction we needed with even the improvements we were having to help them stave off some of the financial troubles they were having. And so literally, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question there.
Yes,
so, if you have to sort of narrow down the top two challenges, or if they had to revisit this growth phase, right? Doing what could have sort of uh, helped them prepare the organization for them to bring in all these people? Is it more about being clear on what their approach of first principles about
Mhm.
what is okay and what is not okay? In other words, this is what we call as culture. Or
Mhm.
is it so? In different ways, there are three layers which in my personal experience where I've felt there can be challenges. One is operational, second is strategic, where you and I don't have alignment on what the company should be doing. The topmost comes to be like people, right? So people in terms of, hey, do I basically trust you on this decision? Can we work together? So where do you think in this case the challenge was? Was it on the people layer? Was it on the alignment on strategy? Or was it more on operational way of working things?
Really, that's a great question and comment. All three layers had problems,
Got it.
for sure. But I think the biggest challenges came from the leadership. So there was great positive movement on the lower levels of the hierarchy in
Got
terms
it.
of managers and supervisors. But the C-suite, the executive leadership, there was so much inconsistency in terms of communication, so much inconsistency in terms of mission, values, culture,
Got
um,
it.
that that people didn't they people were nervous constantly,
Got it.
and lower level managers were always worried about their jobs, because they were getting conflicting information.
Got it.
um, so I think to your first part of your question, what could they have done, what should they have done earlier? um, Basically they shouldn't have waited until they had 2,000 employees, or more, to bring someone like me in to help them.
Got it.
Whether they needed to bring someone in external, an external person in or not, they needed someone. They could have hired someone with that expertise to do it internally, and that would have been fine too.
Got
But
it.
but they didn't address it early on. So what I would say to any organization, from even if you have 5 employees, you should be looking at engagement and satisfaction metrics, and you should be measuring it, and you should be addressing those issues.
Got it.
Certainly, as you grow, if you get up to 20, 50, 100 employees, you absolutely should be doing that. And
Got
when
it.
you get to the point where you have hundreds and thousands of employees, if you're not doing that, um, I can almost guarantee you're going to have major problems.
Got it.
Uh, just
So
just the
is it?
fact that they weren't doing that was a major indicator of all the problems that they were facing.
Got it.
Go
Got it.
ahead. Yeah.
Was it more engagement, measuring engagement is something which uh, is more of a lagging indicator, right? So in terms of a leading indicator, right? Uh, what do you think will be more foundational in doing something which results in, like, say, better engagement? Is it the aspect of as people call out, like clarity of where we are going as a company and alignment on that? Or is it more of psychological safety that, hey, yes, there are a lot of things that is ambiguous in terms of the goal of where we are going, because we are going behind certain opportunities which are not 100% figured out, etc. But
Mm-hmm.
but hey, you know what, that doesn't mean you're going to be affected by this, right? So that's the
Yeah.
psychological safety zone, which,
Yeah.
so in each of these cases the company could have taken either one of these stances, right? So if I have to uh, sort of go back to the company, or if I'm the founder of the company, what do you think I should have done more as a leading, something which impacts the leading indicator? While I understand that, yes, I measure the engagement, I get to know that something is wrong, but how can I be in a place where uh, I know that I'm working in a direction where the engagement is going to be good?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, ultimately, we won't know until we measure, right? Until we do the analyses, but there are basic principles that are pretty much universal in terms of communicating expectations, in terms of creating, like you referred to, psychological safety, right? People aren't going to be committed to an organization if they feel unsafe, and they're not going to be creative and innovative if they feel like they're going to be punished for any little mistake they make, right? So they have to feel safe to try things. They have to feel safe to share their opinion. They have to feel safe. They have to feel that they trust their leaders because their leaders are proactively communicating with them, right? And so as organizations keep those basic principles and concepts in mind as they're going through those early scaling processes, and simultaneously putting in, again, thinking of outcomes, identifying key metrics, productivity and performance metrics, and then putting those things in place so they can start measuring them, then they can be proactive about looking at trends over time and understanding how things are shifting. At my university, for example, now we're not a start, we're not going through scale up, we're not a startup, it's a different context, right? But at our university, for example, we're part of what's called the Best Colleges to Work For survey. This is a US national survey that so many universities participate in, similar to like what I described with the Gallup, where organizations can participate, they contribute their data to it, then they get reports back and they can see how they compare, and they can track things over time. That's the same type of what we're doing at the university. And we do it every year, and we get our data back. And so, some employees at the university, some faculty, some staff are super skeptical about it because they don't see any change over time. They see problems that persist from year to year to year, and in some cases they dip, in some cases they go up a little bit. But one of the questions that's included in that survey is, do the employees trust that the management team will utilize the feedback from the survey data to make positive changes for the organization? And that one indicator, I don't mean to call out my university, but that indicator at my university is not very strong, meaning the common employee, the average employee, doesn't really trust that leadership is going to do anything with the data. They're not going to do anything with the information. Now, I don't think that's true. Personally, I think our leadership team does care about the data and that they are trying to make positive improvements. But if the average employee doesn't believe that, if they don't trust that, then you're not going to have good outcomes, right?
It. So that's sort of a indicator which you sort of identify and then go back and at least start investing. Maybe it could be like a communication aspect, right? You're doing something, but people are still not feeling so maybe you should be over communicating. That could also be the intervention, is your point?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big believer in transparency, and I'm a big believer in communication. And if you're going to err in terms of your communication strategy, if you're going to err on the side of over communication, because when there's not enough information, or people perceive that there's not enough information, regardless of what the reality is, if people perceive it, they perceive a vacuum of information, they will start to fill the vacuum. They'll start to fill the void. They'll start to gossip. They'll start to share their own conspiracy theories. They're going to fill in the gaps that they feel are there. And usually it's not going to be in a positive way. Usually it's going to only hurt the organization. So communicate, over communicate, be transparent, engender and foster trust. These are all just really core elements that any organization is going to face, but particularly a rapidly scaling organization. There's just so much uncertainty. There's so much concern that people have about the situation, and there's so much constant change that's occurring in that environment that you have to take really proactive measures to develop that trust and to maintain it over time. Yeah, I think great question.
Talking about the example that you were talking about that company. So it seemed like the leaders were in denial of developing a culture, maintaining it, and bringing in employment, engagement, and satisfaction measures. So is that a problem that you encounter or you have encountered while talking with various companies, or is ignorance a problem, or they just don't care?
Great question. And I would say yes, all of the above. Honestly, it depends on the organization. It depends on the leader. But it's one of the things that, I teach consulting, for example, at my university. So when I'm teaching students how to do consulting engagements, one of the things we talk a lot about is creating leader buy-in, breaking down resistance and defense mechanisms. Because some leaders, if someone brings you in, they hire you to come in, they obviously believe in you, right? They hired you. But that doesn't mean that other people in the leadership team feel the same way. And there will be resistance. And so you have to work with the team to help reduce that resistance. I've experienced some level of resistance with pretty much every organization I've ever worked with. And so you just have to understand that will be there. But as you communicate with them, as you work collectively with them, jointly with them, to create your approach, to understand the timetable, the deliverables, the types of things you're going to be working on, you can help to break down that resistance. Now, at the particular organization I was describing, absolutely, there was resistance. There was ignorance. There were people who felt like they knew what to do, but clearly didn't. So that's a problem. So some kind of intellectual hubris involved sometimes with leaders who don't want to be told what a more effective approach might be, even when what they're doing, there's clear track record of failure. I mean, there's ego involved, so that you have to deal with that delicately. I mean, there's lots of things that you have to really consider. And I don't claim to have the answer to all of those. I'm not going to get it right all the time when I'm working with organizations. And no matter what I do, it seems, no matter how much I experience, it never ceases to amaze me how new things will come up that I've never experienced before. So it just also draws, it comes back to my point earlier that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work, right? You have to take every new situation afresh. You have to, there are certain commonalities, there are certain principles that apply in most situations, but you have to go in intellectually curious every single time you go in to face this challenge within an organization, because there's going to be unique challenges, there's going to be unique resistance, there's going to be unique issues that have to be faced.
Right. So it seems like a scene of chaos at this particular company that you're talking about. So what were the top 3 or 5 key steps that you took to ensure, to bring in some sort of semblance, in the scene?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I'm sharing this particular example is because we never got past the chaos. And I see that in large part my failure, as I was dealing with the leadership team. And so what the final outcome that I hadn't shared yet was one day I wake up, I'm thinking it's a Monday, right? So we just had the weekend. I'm thinking, okay, what are we going to do this week with this organization? How am I going to help them? And I wake up, I look at my email, and I see an email from the chief HR officer at the organization, who, by the way, fully believed in what we were doing, right? He was fully bought in. Mm-hmm. But he told me, he alerted me to the fact that the company had just filed for bankruptcy, that they just laid off most of their employees, and all of this had happened in an emergency decision-making session of the board over the weekend. And so people were showing up to work Monday morning with the doors closed, with a sign up saying, you don't have a job, right? That's the environment. So chaos led to complete failure in this situation. They went through Title IX bankruptcy. It was just one of those situations where everything about it fell apart, which was incredibly unfortunate. And I think in part, that was because they were frankly trying to address super deep problems too late in the game. Part of it was because even while I'd been working with them for a year and a half, there still hadn't coalesced a common commitment amongst the leadership team into what we were trying to do. So there's still infighting, backstabbing, and internal politicking happening. that was a problem, right? And ultimately, we just didn't get the traction for everything we were trying to do. There were key leaders that were bought in, and then there was a lot of buy-in down the line, but there were too many key stakeholders at the senior level who were secretly undermining things that ultimately it wasn't successful. So that unfortunately was the outcome. I wish I could say it differently. I wish I could say it was complete chaos and we took these 5 steps and in another 2 years we cleaned things up and everything was better, but it wasn't. And it's a cautionary tale for organizations. There was a local company here in Utah. We have what's called Silicon Slopes. So everyone's heard of Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. Well, Utah along the Wasatch Front is also a tech hub and for entrepreneurial tech startups. And so we have what's called Silicon Slopes. And there was a local tech firm startup that had gone through rapid scaling, and seemingly everything was fine. And then all of a sudden they announced mass layoffs, just kind of out of the blue. Like nobody in the industry saw it coming. Nobody, anyone outside of the executive levels at the organization didn't see it coming. And they laid off like half of their workforce, or like almost overnight. And so when those types of things happen, they're cautionary tales. And what every organization needs to be thinking about are what are the mechanisms, how are you creating a sustainable organization? What are the mechanisms you're putting in place to help the organization be successful? How are you communicating with your employees? How are you investing in them? How are you measuring things like motivation, engagement, productivity, satisfaction? But more than just the measurement, how are you utilizing the data from that measurement to reinvest in your employees, and how are you communicating back to them, right? And I think that's what has to happen in any organization, really, but particularly in rapidly scaling up organizations. Otherwise, there's just so many pitfalls along that process of growth that I think it's going to be the rule, not the exception, that you're going to see failure when you have just the inherent problems with that kind of rapid scale up. So some other questions that I thought I would just really quickly address as we're running short on time. How can scaling up a company to measure engagement and satisfaction, how can you go about doing that? And really, it can start super simple. You don't even have to do a formal survey. It could be informal discussions and conversations. And if you do a survey, use existing technology that you have that's free. Google Sheets is fine. You could use SurveyMonkey, right? Like there's lots of ways to do it. It's not complicated. But the more important thing is that you do something, that you start early and that you be consistent. And then over time, you can start to build your capacity and the complexity of what you're doing so that you can have even deeper insights. I think that's just really important. Start simple, be consistent, develop it over time. What can HR leaders do in terms of thinking about employee engagement and satisfaction? What can they do to create comprehensive systems within their organization? Again, from the beginning, everyone needs to be bought in that this is an important thing that they need to be doing. And again, if it's a new tech startup and you have founders who are really more on the technology side, they're good coders or whatever, they may not know or care about this stuff, which is why you need someone on the team early who does understand the importance of this, get the buy-in, create the feedback loops, start collecting the data, and start to have the discussions and the conversations about how you're going to invest and reinvest in your employees to keep them engaged and motivated so they can be productive. How often should you measure? I would say at a minimum, you do it yearly, right? If you have some sort of a systematic approach, at least yearly to track trends over time across divisions, across domains, across direct reporting lines, those sorts of things. But I'm also a huge believer in more continual feedback loops. And so if it's a big long survey that you're trying to do, or big long interviews that you're trying to do, it's not feasible to do it, you know, constantly. You can't do it monthly. You can't do it quarterly even. That's just too much time and energy. But if it's a fairly simple approach that you're taking, then yeah, collect frequent data, give regular, consistent feedback and frequent feedback to people, and employees will value that. And especially if they see how you're utilizing the data that's being collected to make good, positive improvements. And if you're communicating those improvements back to the employees. Another few questions. What should you do if you find that your measures are not actually giving you the desired results? This is the assessment challenge that every organization faces. I honestly don't know of an organization that isn't trying to do better at this. And what it comes down to is you always have to be thinking about what your outcomes are that you want, and what are the metrics that you're measuring to know if you're getting to those outcomes, and is there clear alignment? And when there's not clear alignment, you have to tweak and you have to shift over time. And that means you have to be looking at the data on a regular basis. There's no substitute for consistency here. You need to be doing basic analyses to measure the validity of what of your metrics and the desired outcomes. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, you also have to be thinking about the utility of what you're doing, because, you know, I wear a couple hats. Like on the one hand, I do consulting work, right? And everyone's worried about time and cost. On the other hand, I am a professor and I do academic research. And so when I'm doing something in terms of academic research, I necessarily have a different lens in terms of utility, because there's a certain rigor that is necessary in order for me to do research that I can then publish in academic journals. But when I'm with an organization, working with an organization, they don't necessarily care about that same level of scientific rigor. They want something that will give them good outcomes. And so the utility equation is different. And I usually I'm not going to be successful in getting an organization to commit the time and resources to do the type of analyses that I would want to do to publish in a peer-reviewed academic journal, if that makes sense. So just always be thinking about the utility equation. What's the cost involved with what you're trying to do with your measurement versus the benefit and the outcome for the organization. Do your approaches to measuring employee engagement and satisfaction, do they depend on different contexts? And the short answer is absolutely it does. I referred to this earlier in the model that I shared. Size of company and headcount, geographical location, things like expansion, funding stage, economic conditions, geopolitical, socioeconomic. I mean, there's so many different contextual factors that lead into, you know, what your analysis is going to show and how it's going to impact your organization. So absolutely, you need to be thinking about benchmarking with your industry, benchmarking with your geography when possible. And if you have someone in the organization that has the quantitative competencies to do the data analytics and the statistical analyses, you certainly should try to build in those types of context variables into your assessment models that you're going to be building over time. But that starts to get into a lot of complexity. And I will acknowledge that most organizations don't have the expertise to deal with that kind of complexity in their modeling. And so if that's the case for you, you know, if you are a smaller organization, or you don't have the capacity, or you don't have the time for someone to devote to that kind of level of rigor in your analysis, that's okay. You can still start simple, expand your capacity over time, and to the extent possible, even if it's just a matter of basic descriptive statistics, benchmarking across industries, across geographies, across divisions, that will still be very helpful, and it'll help you can still start to identify some patterns in what you're seeing. And so I would absolutely recommend that every organization try to do that to the extent possible. Another question, would the fundamentals be any different for a 100-member company versus a 500-member company, or 1,000 or 10,000, right? The answer is, of course, again, context matters, so size matters, and how you're going to be going about doing it. And I should add that influences your utility equation, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to collect data with 100 people in terms of opportunity costs, in terms of time involved in collecting the data, running the analyses and everything. It's one thing for 100 people versus 500 or 1,000. So the utility equation shifts over time, but also the complexity of the HRIS system that you need to use. And while I might use a Google form to collect data when I have 20 people on the team, when I have 100 or 1,000 people, I'm not going to be using a Google form anymore, right? So now I need to have more robust technologies that I'm using to facilitate the data collection and analysis and the feeding back of the data. But I do think the fundamentals tend to be the same in terms of the key questions that I outlined earlier and kind of the steps to measuring engagement, the types of questions that you need to be asking, and thinking about the metrics and the outcomes. All those fundamentals are the same, but the complexity of the system that you're going to put the complexity of the system that you're going to put in place and the processes that support it, those will get more complex as you scale up and as you have larger organizations. I think that's absolutely true. Any other types of follow-up questions to these that you have?
I have one question. Typically the founders of companies, I mean, you can call them as the first HR leader of their own organization, right? And you also mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that a manager and any supervisor at any level, they also perform HR functions. I'm assuming most organizations do not think of it this way. So my question is, how can startup founders can prep themselves to do these HR functions, and how can HR work at these levels to ensure that they have employment engagement and satisfaction measures going and working well for the company?
Great questions. It's tough if you don't have founders that understand the necessity of this, that hopefully someone will join the team early enough that does recognize it, even if they don't have the expertise, they recognize the importance, that then they can advocate for investing in it, whether it's bringing in a consultant, hiring another person that has a specialty, whatever. So, I mean, getting that buy-in early is important, and it's hard when you don't have it represented in the founders. And there's no easy answer to that. When people don't know what they don't know, then they're not going to invest in learning about something that they didn't even know was a gap, right? So that's part of the problem. But if people do know it's important, but they know, and they also know that they don't have the expertise, they don't necessarily need to hire a consultant or bring in a full-time person to do that work. There are ways they can train themselves, and there's increasingly more avenues to do that. I mean, things like LinkedIn Learning has so many great resources. There's so many professional resources on YouTube, Khan Academy, free resources that are available all over the place. Webinars like this, right, that companies put out. There's so many opportunities for people to get an understanding of what's important, to run the various aspects of the organization, to upskill in terms of the people elements of the organization and having an employee-centric organization. So if a leader recognizes there's a gap, there's lots of avenues. I'm thinking of like the Society for Human Resource Management. If you don't have a large enough organization to justify having an HR function, having an HR person, doing that function, there are so many resources with organizations like the Society for Human Resource Management, or the HR Certification Institute, or World at Work, or I mean, there's so many organizations that provide content, that provide resources, that provide templates, that provide trainings to help leaders do this, right? When they're small businesses or when they're scaling up.
Right. Sandil, you have any questions?
Not much, Vidya. I think Jonathan pretty much covered most of the things in this presentation.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
let me, oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Let me just wrap things up then with two final main thoughts, okay? When I think about an employee-centric organization, when I think about an organization that truly values its human capital, I think of how we lead our organization. And years ago, I created this model. I mean, there's nothing about this model that's like uniquely innovative. You can find elements of this in lots of other places, right? But I was just sitting down one day thinking about, how do we understand leadership styles? How do we understand how they influence organizations? And I was trying to think of a kind of a generalized way of understanding the connections, right? And for me, it comes down to intellectual humility. It comes down to an attitude of lifelong learning, and it comes down to leaders recognizing the value of their employees and being willing to support and lead them by serving them. So I have this as a foundational core of my own leadership philosophy is servant leadership, and the intersection of leadership with service, where a founder, a manager, a C-suite executive, that they don't see themselves above the other employees, but they recognize the innate value of every employee, the unique value they bring to the table, and then they're going to support them and help them, and so they can leverage that value to help the organization. And when that's the mentality, it leads to really great things. So what you see here with kind of this understanding of a foundational approach to servant leadership is then, if we have intellectual humility as leaders, then we're constantly self-reflecting, and we're constantly trying to better understand ourselves, our own motivations, our own drivers. But like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we can't just assume that what we want is what other people want, or we can't just assume the way we understand things are the ways that other people are going to understand things. And so we also need to proactively try to better understand other people that we lead and serve. We need to break down our personal biases, both our implicit and explicit biases, our prejudices, and we need to better understand the people we work with. And when we do that, it's this feedback loop, right? The more I understand about others, the more I understand about myself. The more I understand about myself, the more I understand about others. And that helps me lead better. But there's also gaps in in the skills and abilities, the capabilities and competencies that we have. So we have to proactively seek to fill those gaps by developing those skills and abilities. We can do that through trainings. We can do that through working with coaches and consultants. We can do that through higher education or informal ways of education. But if we seek lifelong learning, then we will continually be able to develop our skills and abilities. But just learning about something isn't enough. I can't just take a class, I can't just do a Khan Academy course or do a LinkedIn Learning or whatever, and then all of a sudden be a better leader. I have to apply it. And it's through the process of applying it, through my leadership and service of others, that then I continually will get that feedback that you see in the outside feedback loops that come back to my self-understanding and my understanding of others. And that should be a never-ending process. Any good leader is going to continually be going through this process and developing themselves. And when you look at the great organizations and you look at the great leaders who run those organizations, this is what they do. This is what they're constantly doing. And it comes back to them being committed to the purpose of the organization, being committed to their employees, and wanting to help every employee fulfill their human capital capacity, to fulfill their personal potential. It's that commitment, coupled with intellectual humility that allows organizations to be innovative and continually thrive. So that's something that I wanted to take some time to mention. I hope this would be the attitude that any founder would have, that any organizational leader would have, but particularly while they're scaling up, because they're going to be dealing with new problems and issues and challenges that they've never even thought of before, that they've never even conceived. They don't know what they don't know. And so if they're not proactively trying to continually learn and grow, they're gonna miss things. They're gonna miss major things. And ultimately, like in the example I gave, it was chaos and it fell apart. And eventually it turned into one of these cautionary tales of what can happen when you have people driven by their ego, people not being willing to check themselves and to try to work together. That's ultimately what happened in the example I shared, and why they weren't successful. Finally, I'll end, this will be the last main point. How do we get out of our functional silos in our work and as we lead others? This also pertains specifically to rapid scaling up, particularly startups. You have founders that are a mile deep in their expertise. That's why they've come up with some new product or service, some new idea, particularly in the tech industry. For them to have some new idea that's going to really be valued in the market, they're going to have a lot of expertise. But often that expertise is a mile deep and an inch wide. And there's need for that kind of expertise, but there's also need for a breadth of expertise. And so while I'm not, sometimes we think of generalists as kind of like a mile wide and an inch deep. That's not necessarily helpful either. You need to have a combination. So maybe what I'm advocating for is, rather than a mile deep and inch wide or a mile wide and inch deep, maybe we need to have teams that are built of people who have a combination of an interdisciplinary approach, breaking free of functional silos, where they can understand the holistic nature of the business, all the core different functional areas, with enough functional expertise that they can make good decisions. So maybe they're 100 yards wide and 100 yards deep, rather than a mile wide and an inch deep or whatever, right? Does that make sense? The bottom line is, while expertise is important and you do need certain experts to drive innovation, you also need collaboration. And when people get stuck in their silos, collaboration isn't happening. And people aren't talking, getting outside of themselves and getting outside of their own expertise and their own understanding. Most new innovations happen not because someone is a genius and comes up with the new thing that's going to change the world. It usually happens because you get two smart, intelligent people who have different areas of expertise that talk to each other and see a new connection that nobody previously had seen. It's those new connections that are the innovations. And then you build out those connections for the new startup venture, right? So that's more of what we need. And for organizations to scale, they need to work closely together and they need to collaborate well together. So that's what I would advocate for generally, is find a way to break free of our silos, foster a leadership style of servant leadership, and foster an organizational culture of knowledge sharing, of innovation, and being employee centric. And I think when organizations can do that, that will lead to more long-term sustainable growth within the organization. So I think that was the last major point I wanted to make. I welcome questions. You can find out more about me and my business at www.innovativehumancapital.com. You can reach out to me by email. I'm more than happy to talk with anyone offline. Any final thoughts or questions from either of you?